Well, listen, it's such a privilege this morning to be able to visit with you about this perhaps boldest in history effort to invigorate rural people and places, not only in Nebraska and in the heartland of America, but across the country and potentially around the world. Now I'm going to be a little bit like a Presbyterian with a crucifix. How do you work this thing? Let's see. There we go. Good deal. Well, listen, as we think about the Rural Futures Institute, the question is, how indeed do we build success around this big idea of helping rural people and places? If you had the opportunity to watch some of the TED sessions that were on the screens out in the hallway over the last couple of days, you saw one presentation by Simon Sinek about the golden circle. And Simon makes the point that most everyone in every organization knows what they do. And we know what we're doing with the Rural Futures Institute in trying to bring all these resources together to help rural people build a brighter future for themselves and for their communities and for their countries. We know that's what they're doing. We know pretty much how we're doing it, and most companies know how they build the widget that they sell. So how are we doing it? We're bringing together research, education, public policy, engagement, and cultural advocacy in one place to do that. The question is why? And Sinek makes the point that exceptional success occurs when people do what they do because they believe what they believe. And that really gets to the heart of why we're doing the Rural Futures Institute. Skeptics ask, what's so unique about the Rural Futures Institute? And it's an appropriate question. There have been institutions, public, private, and otherwise, agencies of government for more than a century focused on rural issues. They have rural in their title. So what's so unusual about the Rural Futures Institute? I would argue that what is unique about this institution is that we are declaring that we believe that vibrant rural people and places are essential to the fabric of American life. We're not saying we think it'd be nice because it's nostalgic. We're not saying we think this would be a good thing because, gosh, our grandparents grew up on the farm. This is not about that. It is because we believe that a diverse population, widely dispersed population, and strong rural communities is essential to the fabric of American life. And we are going to draw upon any available resource to make the choice of rural community lifestyle more feasible, more sustainable, more attractive, and more productive than it has ever been. That's what is unusual about this effort. That's different. It is multidisciplinary. It crosses all boundaries. I love the theme of this conference in Moving Beyond Boundaries because we have so many self-imposed boundaries around us in rural areas, and we're saying, you know what, they don't matter. We are going to draw upon any available resource to make a difference. So, question is, why should we even worry about rural people and places? We just had a great discussion earlier this morning with a group of external resource people who have been to both of our conferences and really helping us think about many of the questions that we'll be wrestling with in the first months and first years of the Rural Futures Institute. But the point was made this morning that this is not a question just about the rural-urban interface. It is certainly not just about making it nicer in rural areas. It is a species question. What we're talking about in developing strong rural communities, developing an attractive opportunity for young people to establish their lives in rural communities. We're talking about the survival of our species in many cases. It's a pretty big deal. The rural to urban flight, I think it's clear to say, that has occurred as agriculture has changed its structure across generations. that rural to urban flight has not been healthy for our state, certainly not for our country. And as I've traveled to countries around the world, I find that same phenomenon puzzling and creating a conundrum for policy leaders around the world in trying to figure out how we reverse that trend. It's not been good for anyone, and certainly it is a question of our age that we need to wrestle with. The question that follows is, why the University of Nebraska? Well, I know many of you come from outside Nebraska and come from other institutions. I will tell you that as Kathy and I have made the decision to come back and be a part of the Rural Futures Institute from Oklahoma, we're constantly approached, oh, well, isn't that nice? Coming home to Nebraska, coming back to be near family, all that sort of thing. Not so. Those things are nice. But I will tell you that the University of Nebraska has emerged as a global leader in water for food, agricultural production, feeding the world. Here is an institution that has now declared itself as a major land-grant research institution. It has declared that rural people and places is an appropriate focus for one of the great universities in the country, arguably in the world. That was the motivator for us to come back here and be a part of it. The Rural Futures Institute is simply one more step in the life of this university to move forward in what are some of the most critical issues facing the planet. So I am proud to be an alumnus of this great institution. But quite honestly, if the institution were in New Hampshire that had taken on this kind of mission, I would be interested, because I believe it is important to the future of our country. It is important to our future as human beings on the planet. Now, so why the Rural Futures Institute? The fact is, when we look across history and we look at all the institutions that have focused on rural issues, we recognize that too often they have been focused on a segment of what we now recognize is a universe of issues involving rural people. So we must, if we are going to achieve our objective of creating this more attractive environment for young people to establish their families in rural communities, we have to address a number of issues, including the person, the community, the business, technology, transportation, governance, health care, communication, and the heritage underlying those communities. A universe of issues that I believe can only be done with a comprehensive, collaborative, creative, bold, and borderless effort like this. This is unique. It is mind-expanding, if you will, as we try to cover that universe, but I believe this is the right way. And all of you coming to this conference this year for the second year, I have to tell you, it was interesting to me as we thought about year two for the Rural Futures Conference. Year one, we expected there to be a big crowd. It was a new idea, a big idea. And we saw, as one of my old colleagues said last night, we came expecting to see a lot of old familiar faces, a lot of us that had been in the trenches over the years fighting this fight on behalf of rural people. We expected to come see one another at that first conference. It sold out. Had to close registration. But what would happen in year two? What would happen in year two when we weren't giving away quite so many seats? What would happen in year two when maybe the bloom has gone off the rose just a little bit? Then what? Well, it sold out. The fact is, it sold out because good, strong, wise people, multi-talented people coming from the broadest array of interests continued to say, this is an effort that must be undertaken, and I want to be a part of it. So I can't tell you how invigorating it is to me, certainly to all of our team here at the University of Nebraska that are focused on this issue. But I hope it's invigorating to you and the programs that you are already conducting, to know that you have this many colleagues from not only across Nebraska and across the country, but from across the planet who are here this week to help in this effort. So, I want to talk just a minute about how I envision structuring the Institute going forward. This structure that I'm going to lay out for you is not brand new. It is a structure that I originally instituted when we did the merger to create the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. But it has some unique elements that I do want to share with you this morning, and it came out of a collaboration I did with a fellow who's a genuine hero here at the University of Nebraska, and a fellow who was certainly an important mentor to me. Don Clifton was a professor of psychology here at the University of Nebraska, was one of the original folks in positive psychology. Don used to say, I thought that with generations of people in my business studying what's wrong with people and trying to fix it, I thought maybe it was time to study what was right with people and get them to do more of it. So he did some really pioneer work in this area, became the founder of what was then Selection Research Institute, that is now Gallup. When I was looking at the merger of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and bringing together people who really didn't particularly want to work together and who had worked against each other for nearly 100 years in some cases, we had to figure out a new structure, a new way in which to organize our resources around a very important big idea. So I started working with Don and saying, how can we move away from the traditional hierarchy organization structure into something that is genuinely focused around a big idea? And Don said something that has stuck with me and will to my last days. He said, what we must do is create an environment in which good people have the opportunity to do what they do best most of the time. When you do that, great things will happen. So here's where we went, and here's what I am proposing for the Rural Futures Institute. It is a star point structure. It completely moves away from the hierarchy, top-down, harrow structure, if you will, organization, and it is a structure that is, does that work at all? Not so much. There it is. Anyway, the idea is that it is an organization that is structured entirely around mission, vision, and a strong long-term plan. As you see in the center, administration is not at the top driving it down. The operation of administration is simply to see that we continue to be focused upon that mission statement that is in your book, and I hope you have flipped through it and you have read it, because I will tell you the mission and vision for this institute is something you're going to hear a lot about as we move forward. It will be the driving elements in creating this organization. Our mission, as you have read, is building upon the strengths and assets in rural Nebraska, the Great Plains, and globally. The Rural Futures Institute, through a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship, will mobilize the resources of the University of Nebraska and its partners, including community partners. Underline that and in bold, including its community partners, to create knowledge and action that supports rural people and places to achieve unique paths to their desired futures. That's what we're going to be about. There are 5 functioning elements to the Institute: research, education, engagement, public policy, and cultural advocacy. I'm going to talk about each of those just briefly in a moment, but do recognize then in that circle around that star point are the many, and these are only representative audiences. There are many, many more that we can include in that universe. These are all the audiences that we must be able to address in a meaningful way, to engage in a meaningful way if we're going to be successful with the Institute. As I shared with the group this morning, the key will be collaborations. This is never going to be an organization that fills an office building. This is never going to be an organization populated by dozens or hundreds of people, at least in its direct reporting lines. It is an organization that will be built upon collaborations. How do we develop this strategic plan that will be at the center? We begin with our vision. And that vision, as I know you've read in your book, RFI aims to be the world's premier university-based program to provide research-based information, facilitation, and learning opportunities to enable rural people to create genuine economic opportunity, vibrant communities, and better and more sustainable futures. The first part of that statement is key. We intend for this to be the world's greatest gathering of resources around these issues, and to be recognized in that way so that every one of you can be proud of your association with the Rural Futures Institute and know that you are something that you are part of something that is indeed global in its perspective, global in its impact, and one that will be sustainable over the long term. Developing that strategic plan will require going to each of our star points in research, in education, community engagement, public policy, cultural advocacy, and developing specific goals near and long term that do tie back to that vision and the mission that we have established, that we established in collaboration with all of you and many of you at least in planning sessions over 2 years. That will be the key. So what about research? What we're already demonstrating with the work of Mark and the team is that we are listening to folks that are in the field, that are working with rural communities near and far, listening to them about their issues and developing a research agenda at the outset that is built very much on the needs of those communities that we hear expressed back to us. That will continue to be our driving philosophy. Although, clearly, as time goes on, in fact, in the early going, we are going to need to narrow our focus to some degree on highest priority research needs. I think that is our obligation. But again, it will be an ongoing collaborative effort to identify those priorities, see to it that we are directing our greatest resources toward the highest need, but always based back on listening to rural communities, listening to leaders in those communities tell us what the great needs are. Anyway, education. Let me say a word or two. We're going to run out of time. Let me say a word or two about education. Obviously, we already have some wonderful projects underway thanks to the grant process a year ago, but those projects principally focused on works in higher education, interacting with communities. We are doing some wonderful collaborative work, some very creative work involving faculty and community leaders that are creating that interface between students here at the University of Nebraska in particular, although we're involving some other institutions as well, working directly in rural communities, making a difference in leadership development, in entrepreneurial activity, already starting to create that environment in those communities that we want. Question was raised yesterday about K-12 education, and I just want to say briefly today, it is an area of intense interest to me. I believe at my very soul, because I've seen it happening, there are opportunities for learning systems in rural communities that simply do not exist in urban settings. There are creative educators in K-12 systems in rural communities that are understanding that they have an environment there on which they can draw for learning opportunities from high tech to basic science. There are teaching opportunities in rural communities that are unique. I think listen, I'm going to let that go. I just will tell you that I am going to be working, and I know that there's work going on at this university and other universities, particularly here in the heartland, to capitalize on that creative effort in K-12 systems, and I want to be part of encouraging that going forward. We don't have the right answer that comes from the federal government to be laid across every school in the country to best serve our children in a very rapidly changing world. It's just like small business, small schools, small communities, I believe, will be the source of the most creative effort in that area, and I think the Rural Futures Institute has an obligation to be a part of that effort. What about engagement? Again, here is an area where land-grant institutions in particular have a great and long history of working with communities and bringing research-based information out and becoming actionable in those communities. We're in a new world. The needs for engagement and the way in which we engage communities is going to continue to change. We need to be at the forefront of that effort with the Rural Futures Institute. Let me just say that one of the pieces of input that I've had actually from a young faculty member here at UNL is interesting to me in this regard, and that is this. Those of us in philanthropy have long known that we are going through the greatest transfer of wealth from generation to generation ever in the history of mankind. We know that, and so we've talked a lot about how do we capture some of that for the University of Nebraska or for the National Cowboy Museum or wherever that those resources might be channeled. What this faculty member said to me is, beyond worrying about the transfer of wealth, we need to be talking about the transfer of leadership that's going on in this generation, and particularly in rural communities. If we don't understand that we can't continue to rely upon the 4 oldest, fattest, whitest-haired guys in town to make decisions about the future of our communities, we're headed for real disaster. We have to be, as part of our engagement effort, we have to be engaged in leadership development in those communities, developing a diversity of leadership, developing new people with new ideas who indeed plan to be there for the long haul and in fact will be defining that preferred future for a rural community. What about public policy? It was brought up certainly in one of our sessions over the last couple of days that public policy at many levels, from local community to state to federal, has much to do with where we go with our rural enterprises. Believe me, I believe it's an important and serious element of the Rural Futures Institute. I was fortunate to be a part of the early days of establishing the Rural Policy Research Institute, and we have a number of those folks involved with us today, and they're going to have a session later this afternoon. I think our engagement with RUPRI, as well as other units, and we've had engagement with other organizations through the course of the last couple of days who are focused on public policy. It is a critical element of what we're doing. Finally, what about cultural advocacy? I have to tell you, one of the most invigorating parts of this conference this year is recognizing that, at least I felt 15 months ago when we were here in May of 2012, we talked a lot about research, we talked a lot about education and engagement, and we kicked off the grant process there. I thought that was enormously important, but what I didn't hear and what I think is tremendously important is the element of the humanities. The cultural underpinning of rural communities, I think, is an enormously important part of what they are, and by the way, an enormously important draw for young people to go into a community where they can stand on that heritage and to immerse themselves in the heritage of these communities. And they're different in rural New York than they are in rural New Mexico. We have the obligation and the opportunity to support those in the arts who can express that cultural heritage, who can help us capture it, treasure it, enjoy it, and by the way, keep it around for generations to come. It certainly will be an important part of my focus as we move forward with the Institute. Well, let me just say that as I look at this Institute in its very early days, this is the 6th element of my career. And please don't bother me with that, oh, well, a guy can't keep a job. I was very fortunate to be raised in a family, as I mentioned yesterday, where following a number of big ideas in your life was really okay. And I just will tell you that as I come to this 6th chapter, I have 5 other chapters of experience to draw upon. And I will tell you that I believe the keys to success with the RFI will revolve around 3 things: people, resources, and leadership. And, as I look at people that we will employ in this effort, both formally and informally, we're looking for people who are passionate about rural issues, those with demonstrated high talent in these key function areas of research, education, engagement, public policy, and the humanities. We're going to look for people with diverse profiles, ethnically, culturally, geographically, demographically, and folks with high leadership capacity. It is that simple. People will make this happen. That's the way, if I've had a key to success in the first 5 chapters of my career, it has been engaging people of high talent and high passion in something that is bigger than themselves. That's what we're going to be about here. What resources are required? Money, obviously. But beyond money is credibility, communications, and access. Those things have to be employed if indeed we're going to make that star point structure really spin. Strength simply attracts strength. And this institute it must be noted by leadership, by the people that are involved, and leadership as an institution in saying we are willing to move beyond boundaries. We are willing to say that we are going to bring this greatest amassing of resources ever around rural issues to bear to make a difference. We will have to be perceived as a leadership institution. Well, who should care? I would argue that public officials should care. Public officials who should be concerned about the concentration of population on the coast, approaching 60%, over 80% of our population concentrated in 5 megalopolis strips across this country. They ought to be concerned about that. Business leaders who recognize that in a capitalistic system, small business has always been the driver of our national success, ought to care about having strong, vibrant rural communities where small businesses can thrive. Community leaders from across economic, demographic, and societal sectors who acknowledge that encouraging and empowering people of vision is a critical element in community vitality. Educators that see smaller communities offer exceptional opportunities for development of individual talents, independence, and leadership talents. Philanthropists ought to care about the Rural Futures Institute. Philanthropists who want to invest in real world change in an area that means the survival of our country. They ought to care about it. And finally, simply responsible citizens who see that supporting the creative, dynamic, and overall well-being of their neighbors is a critical element in the sustainabilities of their communities. So I would just say that if we assemble the right people around a worthwhile plan, if we do what we do because we believe what we believe, if we give good people the opportunity to do what they do best most of the time around this critically important issue, then we empower rural people, we build strong rural communities, we strengthen our nation, and we show the way for others around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that's worth doing. And I believe that you would not be in this room today if you didn't believe that was worth doing. And I welcome you to this massive enterprise of big ideas. I hope we can be successful. Thank you very much.